Eleanor Reed adjusted her beige cardigan as she settled into seat 14A. At 78, she had mastered the art of traveling light, just a small leather handbag containing her essentials, a paperback novel, and a faded photograph she never left home without. The Denver-bound flight from Philadelphia was filling quickly with business people and vacationers. None paying particular attention to the silver-haired woman gazing out the window. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Young man in a crisp Air Force uniform gestured to the middle seat beside her. "It's not at all." Eleanor smiled, shifting slightly to make room. "Ma'am, hey. Home, ma'am. Just finished some training in Philadelphia." Captain James Winters, he offered with a polite nod, not extending for a handshake as his hands were full with his carry-on. "Eleanor Reed, pleased to meet you, Captain." The captain settled in, and soon the usual pre-flight routines commenced. Eleanor observed the flight attendants with their rehearsed safety demonstrations, remembering how flying had once been an event people dressed up for. Now, it was merely transportation, another mundane part of modern life. "Visiting family, Captain?" Winters asked as the plane began taxiing. "My granddaughter. She's expecting her first child next month. I thought I'd go early, help her prepare." "That's wonderful. Where does she live?" "Colorado Springs. Her husband works at the academy." "Small world," he smiled. "That's where I'm stationed." Eleanor nodded politely, returning to her window. Below, Philadelphia grew smaller, the city grid transforming into a patchwork of suburban developments and then open countryside. She'd made this journey twice a year for the past decade, ever since Thomas passed away. The rhythm of her life had changed, then quieter, smaller in some ways. But she'd found new purpose in being present for her family's milestones. The captain beside her was absorbed in a technical manual, and Eleanor appreciated his respectful distance. So many young people these days felt obligated to fill silence with chatter. She opened her novel but found her mind wandering to her granddaughter, Jessica. Imagining the nursery they would prepare together, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to Thomas. He would have been 82 this year, would have loved being a great-grandfather. Some days his absence felt fresh as yesterday. Other days it was a familiar companion in her life's journey. As the plane climbed higher, Eleanor closed her book. The peaceful routine of flight was comforting, predictable in a world that rarely was. Little did she know that this ordinary stony journey would soon become anything but routine. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt sign illuminated with a sharp ding. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warning of upcoming turbulence. Eleanor had experienced her share of bumpy flights and remained calm as the plane began to shudder. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're hitting some unexpected rough air. Please return to your seats immediately and secure your seatbelts." The plane dropped suddenly, eliciting gasps across the cabin. A young woman across the aisle clutched her armrests, eyes wide with fear. Captain Winters noticed Eleanor's steady hands and calm demeanor. "You've flown a lot, haven't you?" he observed as the plane jolted again. "When you've been alive as long as I have, you'll learn what's worth worrying about," Eleanor replied. "This isn't it." The turbulence intensified. Overhead bins rattled ominously, and a flight attendant stumbled while trying to reach her jump seat. The young woman across the aisle began to hyperventilate. "Excuse me," Eleanor said to Captain Winters, unbuckling her seatbelt during a brief moment of stability. Before he could protest, she slid past him and crossed to the panicking passenger. "Deep breaths, dear," Eleanor said, taking the seat next to her. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. I'm Eleanor." "Bethany," the woman whispered between breaths. "I hate flying. Focus on my voice. Tell me where you're headed in Colorado." As Eleanor calmly talked Bethany through the worst of the turbulence, Captain Winters watched with admiration. When the plane finally reached smoother air and Eleanor returned to her seat, he couldn't help but comment, "That was impressive." "Were you a nurse?" Eleanor chuckled. "You mentioned your last name is Reed. I don't suppose... ... He hesitated. "Any relation to Colonel Thomas Reed?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, he was my husband." Captain Winters' posture straightened involuntarily. "Ma'am, Colonel Reed's mission over Hanoi is legendary at the Academy. They teach it in tactical response courses." Eleanor's fingers found the wedding band she still wore. Thomas never considered himself a hero. He just did what was necessary. With all due respect, Mrs. Reed, saving an entire squadron by drawing enemy fire away from a disabled transport under impossible conditions goes well beyond necessary." His voice had dropped to an almost reverent tone. "The Air Force still uses his radio transmissions as examples of calm under pressure." Eleanor smiled sadly. He was certainly calm under pressure at home, too, even when the doctors told him the cancer was terminal. He just nodded and asked about treatment options. A flight attendant passed by, offering beverages. When she moved on, Captain Winters leaned closer. "Mrs. Reed, it's a true honor to meet you. Would you mind telling me about him? The man behind the legend?" Eleanor studied the young captain's earnest expression. It had been some time since anyone had asked about Thomas. Their friends had aged, memories faded, and the younger generation rarely recognized the name. "Well, Captain Winters, Thomas loved terrible puns and could burn toast just by looking at it," she began, a genuine smile warming her face. "But he also had the most unwavering moral compass of anyone I've ever known." "Thomas wasn't born into military life," Eleanor explained as their conversation deepened. "His father was a postal worker, his mother a librarian, but he had this sense of duty from an early age." Captain Winters listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. Behind them, Bethany and several other passengers had quieted their conversations, straining to hear Eleanor's soft voice. "The mission everyone remembers wasn't even supposed to be his flight," Eleanor continued. "He took another pilot's rotation because that man's wife was in labor with their first child." "I didn't know that part," Winters remarked. "Few do. Child is 53 now, a doctor in Boston. Still sends me Christmas cards." As Eleanor spoke, memories surfaced like treasures long stored away. The homecomings and departures, the missed birthdays and the unexpected moments of joy, the 27 moves and 30 years of service. People focus on that one mission, but Thomas flew countless others, some he couldn't talk about, even to me. She paused, gazing out at the clouds. The hardest part wasn't the danger, it was the silence afterward. The things he carried that couldn't be shared. Flight attendant, who had been hovering nearby, finally approached. "Excuse me, but are you talking about Colonel Reed from the Hanoi evacuation?" Eleanor nodded, surprised. "My father was a crew chief during Vietnam," the attendant said, her voice catching. He spoke of Colonel Reed often. Word spread through. The cabin like wildfire. A retired Army sergeant from first class made his way back to shake Eleanor's hand. A young woman confessed her grandfather had been on the transport Thomas saved. "I never realized how many lives he touched," Eleanor whispered to Captain Winters. "That's the thing about true heroes, Mrs. Reed. Their actions ripple outward for generations." As more passengers gathered to listen, Captain Winters shared the technical details of Thomas's legendary mission, how he'd maneuvered his damaged aircraft to draw anti-aircraft fire away from the vulnerable transport. His engines failing, one by one as he executed a series of tactical maneuvers that became textbook examples. Eleanor added the human dimension, how Thomas had downplayed his actions. How he'd visited the families of the 2 crew members who didn't survive. How he'd struggled with survivor's guilt. "He never wanted recognition," she said. "After the medal ceremony, he put everything in a box in the attic," said the real heroes, "were the ones who didn't come home." Captain Winters nodded solemnly, a common sentiment among the greatest of them. A college student asked what Colonel Reed had done after retiring. "He taught physics at a community college," Eleanor smiled, "and volunteered with veterans. Always said the best part of his day was helping someone understand something new." As Eleanor spoke, she realized she hadn't shared these stories in years. There was healing in the telling, in witnessing the respect in the eyes of strangers who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. "We'll be beginning our descent into Denver shortly," the captain announced over the intercom. Eleanor hadn't noticed. Captain Winters briefly stepped away to use the aircraft phone. Now he returned with a mysterious smile. "Mrs. Reed, would you mind if I made a call when we land? There are some people at Peterson who would want to know you're passing through." As the plane began its descent into Denver International Airport, Captain Winters excused himself again, this time heading toward the cockpit. Eleanor noticed several passengers glancing her way with newfound respect, some nodding politely, others smiling. It felt strange being seen this way, not as an elderly woman, but as the keeper of a legacy. The flight attendant who had mentioned her father approached again. "Mrs. Reed, the captain, has been speaking with our pilots. They've requested permission for a slight routing change." "Is everything all right?" Eleanor asked, concerned. "Everything's perfect," the attendant assured her. "The pilots wanted me to inform you that we'll be taking a special approach path, courtesy of air traffic control." Minutes later, the voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have the honor today of having Eleanor Reed on board, widow of the legendary Colonel Thomas Reed. For those unfamiliar with military aviation history, Colonel Reed's extraordinary courage saved 78 lives during a critical mission in 1972. Air traffic control has granted us permission for a ceremonial approach past Peterson Air Force Base before we land at Denver International." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the cabin. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with unexpected emotion. "Look, Grandma." A child across the aisle pressed his face against the window. "Fighter jets." Eleanor leaned toward her own window. Sure enough, 2 F-16s had taken position alongside their commercial airliner. Flying in perfect formation, an honor guard in the sky. "That's the Thunderbird salute," Captain Winters explained quietly. "Usually reserved for fallen comrades and distinguished service members." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. In all the years since Thomas's funeral, she'd never expected such recognition. The gesture would have embarrassed Thomas terribly, she thought, which somehow made it even more touching. The plane banked gently, offering passengers a view of Peterson Air Force Base below. Even from this height, Eleanor could see unusual activity on the ground. Vehicles moving into position, people gathering. "What's happening?" she asked Captain Winters. "Word travels fast in the Air Force family," he replied with a smile. "Especially when it concerns a legend." As the F-16S peeled away with a traditional missing man formation, applause broke out in the cabin. The pilot's voice returned. "We'll be landing at Denver International in approximately 15 minutes. On behalf of our crew and the United States Air Force, we're honored to have you aboard, Mrs. Reed." Captain Winters looked at Eleanor with genuine respect. "Mrs. Reed, with your permission, there will be transportation waiting to take you to your granddaughter's home after we land. Several officers from Peterson have requested to meet you." Eleanor was speechless. She'd been making this journey twice yearly for a decade, anonymous and unremarkable. Now, because of a chance conversation during turbulence, everything had changed. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "You don't need to say anything," Captain Winters replied. "Just know that your husband's legacy lives on, and so does yours. The sacrifices military spouses make often go unrecognized, but they're no less significant." As the plane's wheels touched down on Denver soil, Eleanor realized this journey had become something entirely unexpected. A homecoming she never anticipated but somehow had always needed. The plane taxied to its gate, but instead of pulling directly to the terminal, it stopped short on the tarmac. Through her window, Eleanor saw what awaited: a formation of Air Force personnel standing at attention. Dress uniforms crisp in the Colorado sunshine. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered. "There." "Here for you, Mrs. Reed," Captain Winters said gently. "For 50 years, you've carried your husband's legacy quietly. Today, they want to acknowledge that." The seatbelt sign dinged off. The flight attendant approached. "Mrs. Reed, you're invited to deplane first. There's a reception committee waiting." Felt suddenly self-conscious in her simple traveling clothes, a beige cardigan, navy slacks, sensible shoes. "I'm hardly dressed for an occasion." "Trust me," Captain Winters smiled. "No one will notice what you're wearing." As Eleanor gathered her handbag, passengers throughout the cabin stood in respect. The pilot emerged from the cockpit to escort her personally. At the aircraft door, she paused, momentarily overwhelmed. "I'll be right beside you," Captain Winters assured her. Eleanor descended the stairs with careful steps. The bright Colorado sun warmed her face as she reached the tarmac. Before her stood 3 rows of Air Force personnel, young men and women, who hadn't even been born when Thomas performed his acts of heroism. At their center stood a gray-haired general who stepped forward as Eleanor approached. "Mrs. Reed," he said, saluting crisply. "General Robert Donovan. I was a lieutenant when your husband saved my life and the lives of my comrades. It's my profound honor to welcome you to Colorado." Eleanor recognized the name immediately. "Donovan. Thomas mentioned you often. He wrote to us every Christmas." The general's composure wavered momentarily. "Your husband was the finest officer I ever served with. When we received word you were arriving, everyone wanted to be here." He gestured behind him where the formation stood at perfect attention. "Present arms," he commanded. 70-8 sabers rose in unison, one for each life Thomas had saved. The symbolism wasn't lost on Eleanor. A young female lieutenant stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. "Mrs. Reed, we found this in the Academy archives. We thought you should have it." Inside lay Thomas's original pilot wings, which he donated to the Academy Museum decades ago. "We've made a duplicate for our display," General Donovan explained. "These belong with family." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she touched the wings. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible, as the formation dissolved. Officers approached one by one to share connections to Thomas's story, grandchildren of those he'd saved. Students who'd studied his tactics, pilots who'd drawn inspiration from his example. At the edge of the gatherings, Eleanor spotted a familiar face, her granddaughter Jessica, very pregnant and beaming with pride. "Grandma." Jessica embraced her. "Captain Winters called us." "I had no idea about all this." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted, still processing the magnitude of the moment. As they prepared to leave, General Donovan approached once more. "Mrs. Reed, Thomas's actions saved my life. But you were the one who supported him through every deployment, every move, every struggle. The Air Force salutes you both today." Eleanor smiled through tears. Thomas always said he could only soar because he had solid ground to return to. As they drove away, Eleanor watched the formation of blue uniforms disperse. For decades, she'd carried Thomas's memory quietly, a private weight of love and loss. Today, that burden had somehow lightened, shared among those who understood its value. "You know," she said to Jessica, "your grandfather would have been mortified by all this attention." Jessica squeezed her hand, but proud that they remembered, "Don't you think?" Eleanor nodded, her fingers finding the pilot wings in her pocket. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe he would be." In the quiet of her heart, Eleanor felt Thomas's presence stronger than she had in years, not as a legend discussed by strangers, but as the man who had laughed at his own cooking disasters, who had read poetry aloud on summer evenings, who had loved his family fiercely through decades of service. True honor, she realized, wasn't found in ceremonies or salutes, but in being remembered for who you truly were. And today, both she and Thomas had been seen not just for his one famous act of heroism, but for the lifetime of quiet sacrifice they had shared.